A thick fog settled over the city of Fairhaven, curling around buildings like a silent predator. The distant sound of sirens cut through the night, their wails blending with the muffled screams rising from the streets below. Something was terribly wrong. Aidan Carter stood frozen in the doorway of his small apartment, staring at his phone. The news anchors stammered incoherently, their carefully trained voices cracking under the weight of sheer terror. Words like infection, mass panic, and violent attacks scrolled across the screen. Then came the footage. Shaky cell phone videos showed people attacking each other, tearing into each other. A man in a business suit lunged at a screaming woman, sinking his teeth into her throat. Another clip showed a police officer firing point-blank into the chest of an attacker, only for the figure to keep coming, its eyes clouded and dead. Aidan's pulse pounded in his ears. He had seen death before, had even tried to fight against it in the back of an ambulance countless times, but this? This was something else. Then, a blood-curdling shriek shattered the fragile silence outside his window. Aidan rushed to the glass, his breath fogging up the pain. The street below was chaos. People ran in every direction, some falling as they were pulled down by others who moved with inhuman speed. A car crashed into a fire hydrant, water spraying like a geyser. A woman stumbled out of the vehicle, only to be swarmed by figures who clawed at her like rabid animals. He yanked his backpack from the closet, stuffing it with essentials, bottled water, granola bars, a flashlight. His first aid kit from his paramedic days was already inside. He grabbed a baseball bat from beside the door. Then, the power went out. Darkness swallowed the apartment, and for the first time, Aidan realized how thin the walls were. On the other side of his front door, something heavy slammed against the hallway wall. A choked gurgle followed. "Not staying here." He pulled open the door cautiously, bat raised. The hallway reeked of blood and something worse, something rotten. The flickering emergency lights cast long, twitching shadows. A figure crouched over a body near the stairwell, its back rising and falling in jerky movements. Aidan's breath caught in his throat as the thing, a man, slowly turned its head toward him. Its face was unrecognizable, flesh torn away from its cheek, exposing teeth in a permanent snarl. Blood dripped from its mouth. Its eyes, cloudy, lifeless, locked onto Aidan's. Then, it moved. With a guttural growl, the thing lunged. Aidan swung the bat, the impact jarring his arms as the creature staggered back. But it barely seemed to notice. It came at him again. Aidan didn't hesitate. He swung harder, aiming for the skull. A sickening crunch filled the air, and the figure collapsed, twitching once before going still. His chest heaved. His hands trembled. He had just killed a man. No, that wasn't a man anymore. Shouts and screams echoed from below. More of them were coming. Aidan sprinted down the stairs, heart hammering. The lobby was a war zone, bodies littered the floor, and fresh ones still twitched as they were devoured. He spotted an opening and bolted for the door. The city was burning. Flames licked at buildings. Cars were overturned, their alarms blaring uselessly. People, some alive, some not, moved through the streets like a living nightmare. Aidan's mind raced. Get out of the city. That was the only plan he had. A group of survivors huddled near a pharmacy across the street, waving him over. They looked terrified, but alive. For a moment, he hesitated. Was it safer alone? Then, a horrifying, blood-drenched figure burst from a shattered storefront, moving faster than any corpse should. It wasn't alone. Aidan ran. And the nightmare was just beginning. Aidan sprinted through the burning city, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The sounds of chaos surrounded him, screams, gunfire, the guttural growls of the undead. He had no plan, just one instinct: survive. The group near the pharmacy had vanished, scattered by the sudden attack. He hadn't waited to see what happened to them. The streets weren't safe, nowhere was safe. Cutting through an alleyway, Aiden skidded to a stop. A chain-link fence loomed ahead, the only way out blocked. Behind him, shadows shifted. The snarling and guttural moans grew louder. No choice. He gripped the fence and scrambled up, his muscles screaming as he pulled himself over. As he swung his legs to the other side, a cold, rotting hand grasped his ankle. Aiden yelped, kicking wildly. The creature's fingers were slick with blood, its grip strong. With one final kick, he broke free, landing hard on the pavement. Pain shot through his knee, but he didn't stop. The fence rattled violently as more of them pressed against it, their decayed faces twisted in mindless hunger. The metal groaned, but it held, for now. Limping forward, Aiden took in his surroundings. The alley led into a residential district, the streets eerily quiet compared to the city's chaos. Burnt-out cars lined the road, some with doors still hanging open. A half-eaten corpse lay against a mailbox, its face frozen in horror. Aiden swallowed hard. Then, movement. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness from a nearby townhouse. Someone was inside. He hesitated. Going in blind is a risk. But staying out here is worse. He crept toward the door, bat clenched tightly. Before he could knock, the door flew open. A rifle barrel was in his face. "Who the hell are you?" a woman demanded. She had short, dark hair, her face streaked with sweat and dirt. "Not one of them," Aiden said, raising his hands. "Just looking for shelter." The woman studied him, then yanked him inside, slamming the door. Inside, a small group of survivors huddled in the dimly lit living room, 4 of them, all tense and watching him. A middle-aged man, his arm wrapped in bloody bandages, sat near the fireplace. A younger man and woman clutched makeshift weapons, their faces pale. The woman with the rifle, clearly the leader, locked the door and turned to him. "You're lucky we're letting you in," she said. "I'm Evelyn. This is our group." Aiden nodded. "Aiden Carter." Evelyn didn't lower her rifle. "How do we know you're not infected?" "I was a paramedic before all this," Aiden said, keeping his voice steady. "I know the symptoms. No bites, no fever. Just a bruised knee." The group exchanged glances. Finally, Evelyn lowered the gun. "Fine. But you pull anything, and I'll put you down myself." Aiden exhaled. "Fair enough." He settled onto the floor, exhaustion setting in. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the weight of what was happening crashed down on him. "We've been holed up here since it started," the young man, Lucas, explained. "Thought the military would come. They didn't." "They won't," Evelyn muttered. "The city's lost." The older man, Greg, groaned in pain, gripping his bandaged arm. "We're running low on supplies. Medicine. Food. We need to leave." Evelyn sighed. "Leaving is suicide." Aiden rubbed his face. "Staying isn't much better. It's only a matter of time before they overrun this place." Silence. Then, a noise outside. A low, dragging shuffle. Aiden tensed, glancing at the others. Then came the scratching. Slow. Persistent. Someone, or something, was at the door. Evelyn motioned for silence, raising a finger to her lips. The room fell deathly quiet. Then, bang! The door shuddered violently. Greg cursed under his breath. More shuffling. More growls. More of them were gathering. Aiden's heart pounded. "We need to move. Now." Evelyn nodded. "Grab what you can. We're leaving." They had only minutes before the horde broke through. And outside, the city of the dead was waiting. The door wouldn't hold for long. Aiden tightened the straps of his backpack, his mind racing. The low growls outside were growing louder, more insistent. The undead were pressing against the walls, their hunger driving them forward. The house wouldn't be safe much longer. "Where do we go?" Lucas whispered, his grip tightening around a rusted crowbar. "The highway," Evelyn said. "We need to get out of the city before it's too late." Aiden frowned. Highways are a risk. If people try to flee, there'll be wrecks, abandoned cars, and a whole lot of them. Evelyn looked at him. "You got a better idea?" Aiden didn't. She nodded toward the back door. "We go out through the yard. Stay low, stay quiet." They moved fast. The backyard was enclosed by a wooden fence, splintered and cracked in places. Evelyn motioned to Lucas, and he quietly unlatched the gate, peering out. "All clear," he whispered. One by one, they slipped into the night. The city was dying. Smoke curled from distant fires. The skyline was dark, save for the occasional flicker of emergency lights. The distant sound of gunfire cracked through the air, followed by screams. No rescue was coming. Aiden gritted his teeth as they crept down an abandoned street. Every shadow felt like a threat, every sudden noise a potential death sentence. They reached the main road. The highway loomed ahead, stretching out into the darkness. Dozens of cars sat abandoned, some with doors still open, their owners long gone, or worse. Aiden scanned the area. "If we're lucky, we can find a working car." Evelyn nodded. "Stay close. Watch your surroundings." They moved cautiously, weaving between rusted vehicles. Some cars had shattered windows, streaked with dried blood. Others had bodies slumped inside, twisted in unnatural angles. Lucas gagged. "God. Keep it together," Evelyn muttered. Aiden kept his bat raised, eyes scanning the wreckage. Something felt wrong. Then, a soft sound. A wet snarl. Aiden turned just as the first zombie lunged from behind a truck. "Move," he shouted. The creature slammed into Evelyn, knocking her to the ground. Its jaw snapped inches from her face, blood and saliva dripping from its rotting lips. Aiden swung his bat. Crack. The thing's skull caved in, and it collapsed in a twitching heap. Then, more growls. Shadows moved between the cars. They weren't alone. "Run!" Evelyn shouted. The group broke into a sprint, weaving between the vehicles. Figures lurched from the wreckage, their milky eyes locking onto fresh prey. Aiden's breath burned in his chest. The exit ramp was just ahead. If they could reach it. A gunshot rang out. Aiden skidded to a stop. Not from behind. From ahead. A flare of light illuminated the highway. Figures stood atop an overturned bus, rifles in hand. Survivors. Aiden almost called out, until he saw the bodies at their feet. Not zombies. People. Evelyn grabbed his arm, pulling him behind a car. "Not friendly," she whispered. Aiden's heart pounded. He stole another glance. The men atop the bus wore mismatched gear, military vests, torn jackets, blood-stained clothes. Bandits. A car alarm suddenly blared, the shrill sound cutting through the night. The bandits turned. One of them, a tall man with a rifle, pointed. "We got movement." Aiden cursed. Then, more snarls. The zombies were coming. "Go, now!" Evelyn shouted. They sprinted toward the side of the highway, veering away from the bandits. Gunfire erupted behind them. The bandits weren't shooting at them. They were shooting at the undead. Aiden stole a glance back. The zombies were swarming, their numbers overwhelming. The bandits fired wildly, but it was useless. The dead didn't stop. One of the bandits screamed as he was dragged from the bus, his rifle clattering to the pavement. The others ran. Aiden didn't stay to watch. The group clambered over a guardrail, sliding down a grassy embankment. The sounds of chaos faded as they disappeared into the tree line. They ran until their lungs burned. Only when the city lights were a distant glow did they finally stop. Evelyn bent over, hands on her knees, panting. That was close. Aiden wiped sweat from his brow. Too close. Lucas sat heavily on the ground. So what now? Aiden looked back toward the city. The world had gone to hell. And the worst was yet to come. The forest was eerily quiet. The distant moans of the undead were a constant reminder of what lay behind them, but here, beneath the dense canopy, it felt like another world, one where silence could kill. Aiden leaned against a tree, catching his breath. His arms ached from running, his fingers still clenched around the bat. Beside him, Evelyn scanned the darkness, her rifle raised. "We need to find shelter," she said, her voice low. Greg, the older man, was struggling to keep up. His bandaged arm was soaked with fresh blood, his breathing shallow. Lucas and the young woman, Sarah, hovered nearby, unsure of what to do. "If we don't stop soon, he's not going to make it," Sarah murmured. Aiden knelt beside Greg, inspecting the wound. It was bad, deep, jagged. It wasn't a bite, but infection was setting in. If they didn't clean it soon, he'd be dead before sunrise. "There's a cabin nearby," Evelyn said suddenly. Aiden looked up. "You sure?" She nodded. "Hunters use it. About a mile west. Should be abandoned." They had no other choice. Moving carefully, they made their way through the trees, sticking to the shadows. Every snap of a twig sent their hearts racing, every shifting branch a potential threat. The dead weren't the only things lurking in the dark. By the time they reached the cabin, Greg was barely conscious. It was a small, run-down structure, but it was intact. The door was locked, but Evelyn kicked it open with a single well-placed boot. Inside, dust and mildew clung to the air. Old furniture was overturned, and empty cans littered the floor. Someone had been here before, but not recently. Aiden set Greg down on the couch, pulling out his first aid kit. He worked quickly, cleaning the wound as best he could. "He needs antibiotics," he muttered. "Where the hell are we supposed to find those?" Lucas asked. Evelyn was already checking the cabinets. "Maybe there's something here." Sarah stood near the window, arms wrapped around herself. "We shouldn't stay long." Aiden knew she was right. But for now, they needed rest. Hours passed. The fire in the small stone fireplace crackled softly, casting shadows across the walls. Outside, the wind howled. Aiden couldn't sleep. Something was off. He sat up slowly, glancing around. Evelyn was on watch by the door. Lucas and Sarah were curled up in the corner. Greg was awake. His fevered eyes met Aiden's. "They're watching us," he rasped. Aiden frowned. "Who?" Greg's breathing hitched. His fingers trembled as he pointed toward the window. Aiden turned, and froze. A figure stood just beyond the tree line. A man. Not a zombie. Aiden's grip tightened on his bat. He wasn't sure how long the man had been there, but now that he saw him, he realized there were more. 3. No, 4. All watching. "Evelyn," Aiden whispered. She turned, followed his gaze. Her expression hardened. Then, one of the men stepped forward, raising his hands. "No need for trouble," he called out. His voice was calm, too calm. "Just travelers like you." Aiden didn't believe that for a second. Evelyn kept her rifle trained on them. "Keep moving," she warned. The man smirked. "Come on now. You don't want to be out here alone, do you?" Aiden tensed. He could hear it in the man's voice, he wasn't asking. They weren't alone by accident. They had been followed. Evelyn glanced at Aiden. A silent agreement passed between them. This wasn't going to end peacefully. The man sighed. "Well, that's a shame." Then, he whistled. Something crashed against the side of the cabin. Sarah screamed. The door burst open. Two of them rushed in, knives flashing in the firelight. Aiden reacted on instinct. He swung his bat, cracking one across the jaw. The man stumbled back, spitting blood. Evelyn fired. The gunshot was deafening in the small space. The second attacker dropped, his body hitting the floor with a sickening thud. Lucas tackled another, struggling to keep the knife away from his throat. Greg groaned, trying to sit up, but he was too weak. Aiden turned, just in time to see the first man lunging for Sarah. She wasn't fast enough. The knife plunged into her stomach. Her scream cut through the night. Rage exploded in Aiden's chest. He swung hard, the bat connecting with the man's temple. He collapsed instantly, twitching once before going still. Sarah crumpled to the floor, clutching her wound. Evelyn rushed to her, pressing down on the wound. "Stay with me," she whispered. Outside, the remaining bandits fled into the trees. Cowards. Aiden's hands shook. The cabin was quiet again, but the damage was done. Sarah was dying. Greg was barely holding on. And now, the gunshot would bring more than just trouble. It would bring the dead. Sarah's gasping breaths filled the cabin, her hands slick with her own blood. Aiden knelt beside her, pressing hard on the wound to slow the bleeding, but the deep crimson pooling beneath her fingers told him it wasn't enough. "Stay with me," Evelyn murmured, her voice tight with urgency. Sarah's lips trembled. "It hurts." Aiden clenched his jaw. He had seen wounds like this before, too deep, too much blood lost. If they didn't get proper medical supplies soon, she wouldn't make it through the night. Greg groaned from the couch, still barely conscious. 2 people down, and no help in sight. Lucas sat in the corner, trembling. His hands shook as he stared at Sarah's wound. He had barely spoken since the attack, his mind struggling to process what had happened. Aiden turned to Evelyn. "We need supplies. If she has any chance." Evelyn cut him off. "I know." She pushed back from Sarah, standing up. "There's a town a few miles from here. I passed it before meeting you. A pharmacy, maybe a clinic. We go now." Aiden frowned. "What about the bandits? What if they're still out there?" Evelyn's eyes darkened. "Then we deal with them." A low, inhuman growl rumbled from outside. Aiden's blood ran cold. Lucas stiffened. "Did you hear that?" They all did. Another growl. Then another. Aiden's stomach clenched. The gunshot. It had been too loud. Too much noise in a world where sound was a death sentence. The dead were coming. Evelyn darted to the window. Through the moonlit trees, movement shifted. Shadows swayed, unnatural and slow. Dozens of them. Maybe more. Aiden swallowed hard. "They're here." Sarah whimpered from the floor. Lucas finally snapped out of his daze, rushing to her side. "We can't stay," Evelyn said. "We need to go. Now." Aiden hesitated. "Greg and Sarah. We carry them if we have to," Evelyn snapped. The first hand slapped against the window. A rotten, decomposed face pressed against the glass, milky eyes unfocused but hungry. More hands. More moans. Then, bang! The front door rattled violently. They were surrounded. Aiden's breath came fast. The bandits had weakened them, distracted them. Now the dead would finish the job. Evelyn looked around frantically. The back door. Lucas was already moving, hoisting Sarah up with a strained grunt. "Come on, we can still make it." Greg groaned as Aiden pulled him up. The man was barely conscious, his fever worsening. Another slam against the front door. The wood cracked, splintering at the edges. Aiden and Evelyn led the way, pushing into the tiny kitchen where a second door led outside. Evelyn threw it open. And froze. A figure stood just beyond the threshold. Not a zombie. One of the bandits. The same man who had spoken to them earlier, his lips still bleeding from Aiden's bat. He grinned. "Going somewhere?" Evelyn fired. The gunshot echoed through the trees. The bandit jerked back, a hole punched clean through his chest. But the noise had sealed their fate. The dead surged against the walls. The front door burst open. They poured inside. Aiden didn't think. He grabbed Greg, half dragging him out the back as Evelyn kicked the bandit's corpse aside. The group sprinted into the woods. Behind them, the cabin was lost in an explosion of snarls and tearing flesh. The dead were feasting. But more were still coming. Aiden didn't stop running. He didn't look back. Sarah gasped weakly in Lucas's arms, her blood leaving a trail. Greg mumbled incoherently, his fever worsening. Evelyn reloaded her rifle as she ran, jaw clenched. They couldn't stop. Not here. Ahead, the trees thinned. The dark outline of buildings appeared in the distance. The town. Aiden's chest burned as he pushed forward. They had escaped the cabin. But the nightmare was far from over. The town loomed ahead, shrouded in an eerie stillness. The moonlight cast long, unnatural shadows over the abandoned buildings, their broken windows like empty eyes watching the group's approach. Aiden's legs burned from running, but he forced himself forward, dragging Greg's nearly limp body along. Lucas struggled beside him, Sarah's weight slowing him down. She was barely conscious now, her breath shallow and uneven. Evelyn was already scanning the streets, rifle raised. "We find the pharmacy, grab what we need, and get the hell out." Aiden nodded. "And if the dead followed us?" She gave him a grim look. "Then we move fast." They entered the outskirts, slipping through a narrow alleyway between two buildings. The air was thick with the stench of rot and stagnant death. Cars sat abandoned in the street, some with doors open, others covered in dried blood. A flickering neon sign hung above a small pharmacy at the corner of the main road. "There." Evelyn pointed. Lucas looked hesitant. "What if it's already looted?" Aiden sighed. "Then we pray they left something behind." They crept toward the pharmacy, keeping to the shadows. Every step felt dangerous, every breath too loud. The town was quiet, but that didn't mean it was empty. Evelyn reached the door first. She tried the handle. Locked. Aiden grabbed a nearby brick and smashed it through the glass. The sound rang through the street like a gunshot. Everyone froze. Silence. Then, a distant growl. Evelyn cursed. "Hurry up." Aiden climbed through the broken window, careful not to cut himself. The inside was a mess, shelves overturned, empty pill bottles littering the floor. He moved fast, grabbing anything that looked useful. Bandages, painkillers, alcohol. "Antibiotics," Evelyn hissed from the window. "We need them for Greg." Aiden searched frantically. Most of the medicine had been cleared out, but at the very back of a shelf, hidden behind a fallen display, he found a single bottle of amoxicillin. "Got it," he called. A sudden crash echoed outside. Lucas cursed. "They're here." Aiden shoved the supplies into his bag and rushed back to the window. The first zombie appeared at the end of the street. Then another. And another. Dozens. Their moans grew louder, their movements jerky and unnatural as they stumbled toward the pharmacy. "We need to move," Evelyn shouted. Aiden climbed out just as Lucas nearly dropped Sarah. She groaned weakly, her body trembling from blood loss. Greg wasn't doing much better, barely keeping himself upright. "We'll never outrun them carrying them like this," Lucas panted. Aiden's mind raced. There had to be a way out. Somewhere to hide. His eyes landed on an old truck parked across the street. "If it has keys, we drive." Evelyn didn't argue. She sprinted to the truck, yanking the driver's side door open. Aiden shoved Greg into the back seat while Lucas climbed in with Sarah. Evelyn searched frantically. No keys. The horde was closing in. Aiden spotted the glove compartment. He ripped it open. Keys. Without hesitation, he shoved them into the ignition and turned. The truck sputtered. Then, roared to life. The zombies surged forward. "Go, go, go!" Lucas screamed. Evelyn didn't wait. She slammed her foot on the gas. The truck shot forward, tires screeching against the pavement. The undead lunged, some getting clipped by the bumper, others crushed beneath the wheels. But the town was crawling with them. They spilled from alleys, from shattered windows, from overturned cars. Aiden gritted his teeth. "We need a way out." "The highway," Evelyn said, gripping the wheel. "We get out of town before we're trapped." She swerved sharply, avoiding a wrecked police cruiser. Zombies clawed at the windows as the truck barreled through the street. Aiden turned to the back seat. Sarah was slipping fast. Greg's eyes were unfocused. They were running out of time. Evelyn pushed the gas harder. The highway entrance was just ahead. If they could make it. A figure stepped into the road. Not a zombie. A man. Dressed in black, holding a rifle. Evelyn barely had time to react. The gunshot shattered the windshield. She jerked the wheel. The truck spun out of control. Aiden barely had time to register what was happening before the world flipped upside down. Then, impact. Darkness. Silence. Then, moans. The dead were coming. Aiden's world was spinning. His head throbbed, a sharp ringing in his ears drowning out everything else. For a moment, all he could see was darkness. Then, pain. A deep, searing pain in his ribs. He gasped, sucking in air. The truck was on its side, the windshield shattered, glass cutting into his skin. His vision swam, but he forced himself to focus. The moans were getting closer. Evelyn groaned from the driver's seat, still strapped in, blood trickling down her temple. Lucas was moving, coughing violently. Sarah and Greg. Aiden turned. Sarah was still unconscious in the back seat, her body limp. Greg wasn't moving. No. Aiden reached for him, shaking his shoulder. "Greg." No response. A cold dread crept into his stomach. "Damn it." Evelyn hissed, unbuckling herself and kicking at the crumpled door. "We need to get out of here now." Lucas groaned as he pulled himself up, his arm twisted at an unnatural angle. I think my arm's broken." Aiden forced himself to breathe. The truck was wrecked, tilted against a half-collapsed wall. The entire street outside was crawling with the dead. They were closing in, drawn by the noise of the crash. One of them slammed against the broken window, its rotting face pushing through the shattered glass. Aiden reacted on instinct. He grabbed a shard of glass and rammed it into the creature's skull. It collapsed instantly. But more were coming. Sarah stirred slightly, her lips trembling. Aiden. He turned to Lucas. Help me get her out. Lucas gritted his teeth, nodding despite the pain. Evelyn had managed to force the door open, crawling out into the night. She looked around, rifle raised. We're surrounded. Aiden cursed. Options? Evelyn glanced at the buildings. That store across the street. Looks like a hardware shop. We can barricade inside. Lucas hesitated. What about Greg? Aiden looked down. He already knew the answer. Greg was gone. His fevered eyes were now dull and lifeless. His chest no longer rose and fell. But he wouldn't stay that way. Aiden swallowed hard, heart pounding. He grabbed a knife from his belt. I'll do it. Lucas turned away, his face pale. Aiden clenched his jaw. I'm sorry. The knife slid into Greg's skull with a sickening crunch. There was no time to grieve. Evelyn yanked the door open wider. Move. Aiden grabbed Sarah, hauling her over his shoulder as best he could. Lucas followed, cradling his broken arm. Evelyn covered them, firing into the approaching horde. They sprinted across the street. The dead were everywhere, but Evelyn was fast, taking down any that got too close. Aiden kept moving, his entire body screaming in protest. The hardware store's entrance was still intact. Evelyn reached it first, shoving the door open. Inside. Now. Aiden rushed in, nearly collapsing from the weight of Sarah. Lucas stumbled in behind him, his face pale with pain. Evelyn slammed the door shut. Seconds later, the first zombies crashed against the glass. Their rotting hands clawed at the windows, their guttural moans filling the air. Aiden laid Sarah down carefully, checking her pulse. She was alive, for now. Lucas leaned against the counter, cradling his arm. We can't stay here long. Evelyn was already searching the shelves. We need something to reinforce the doors. Aiden looked around. The store was filled with tools, wood planks, nails, everything they needed to hold the dead back. But it wouldn't last forever. And worse, whoever had shot at them was still out there. Aiden clenched his fists. They had made it out of the truck. They had made it into the store. But survival was still far from guaranteed. And the night was far from over. The pounding on the glass intensified. The dead pressed against the storefront, their moans rising into a hungry crescendo. The door shuddered under their weight, the wood creaking, the hinges groaning. Aiden's pulse pounded in his ears as he knelt beside Sarah, checking her pulse. It was weak, but still there. Lucas slumped against the counter, clutching his broken arm. His face was pale, drenched in sweat. That door's not gonna hold, he muttered. Evelyn gritted her teeth. Then we reinforce it. She grabbed a hammer from a nearby shelf and threw a bundle of nails at Aiden. Find something to barricade it with. Fast. Aiden's eyes swept the store. Near the back, there were stacks of wooden planks, likely for repairs. He ran to them, grabbing as many as he could. Lucas struggled to his feet, his good hand helping to brace the first board against the door. Evelyn worked quickly, hammering the nails in place. The first plank went up. Then the second. But the dead weren't slowing down. The glass cracked. Aiden pounded in another nail, hands shaking. It's not enough, he gritted out. Evelyn swore under her breath. Then we find another way out. Lucas turned, his eyes scanning the dimly lit store. There's a back exit, right? Aiden nodded. Most stores had one. Then Lucas stopped, his face suddenly drained of color. Aiden followed his gaze. The back door was open. And standing in the doorway was a figure dressed in black, rifle in hand. The shooter. Aiden's blood ran cold. The man stepped forward, his boots silent on the tiled floor. His face was hidden beneath a hood, but his voice was steady, eerily calm. "You led them right to me," he said. Evelyn raised her rifle without hesitation. "Drop the gun." The man tilted his head slightly, unbothered. "You don't understand. This town, it's mine." Aiden tightened his grip on the hammer. "We don't want trouble. We just needed supplies." The man let out a dry chuckle. "You already brought it. And now they're everywhere." As if on cue, the glass at the front shattered. The dead poured inside. Evelyn fired first. The bullet tore through the head of the nearest zombie, sending it sprawling. The man in black cursed and turned his rifle on them. "This is your mess." Aiden didn't think. He grabbed a wrench from the counter and hurled it. The tool struck the man's wrist, knocking his aim off just as he fired. The bullet went wide, shattering a shelf instead. Evelyn took her shot. The man jerked back as the bullet tore into his shoulder. He staggered, dropping his rifle, his face twisting in pain. But the dead didn't care about their fight. They only smelled fresh meat. The first zombie grabbed the man from behind, sinking its teeth into his neck. He screamed. The others swarmed him in seconds, dragging him down. Aiden turned away. There was no saving him now. "Go!" Evelyn shouted, grabbing Lucas and hauling him toward the back. Aiden grabbed Sarah, hoisting her up as best he could. The four of them sprinted for the back exit, the sound of flesh tearing behind them. They burst out into the alley, gulping in the cold night air. Evelyn slammed the door shut behind them, jamming a metal rod through the handle. For a brief moment, the only sound was their own ragged breathing. Then, distant moans. More of them. Aiden looked up at the night sky, the stars barely visible through the thick clouds. No safe haven. No rest. Just the road ahead. Sarah stirred weakly in his arms. She was still alive. Lucas winced, clutching his broken arm. Evelyn exhaled sharply, reloading her rifle. "We keep moving." Aiden nodded. There was no other choice. The world had ended. But they were still here. And as long as they were breathing, the fight wasn't over. They disappeared into the night. Survivors. For now. The end.